The Human Cycle by Sri Aurobindo. Chapter 21. The Spiritual Aim and Life. A society founded upon spirituality will differ in two essential points from the normal human society, which begins from and ends with the lower nature. The normal human society starts from the gregarious instinct, modified by a diversity and possible antagonism of interests, from an association and clash of egos, from a meeting, combination, conflict of ideas, tendencies, and principles. It tries first to patch up an accommodation of converging interests and a treaty of peace between discords, founded on a series of implied contracts, natural or necessary adjustments which become customs of the aggregate life. And to these contracts, as they develop, it gives the name of social law. By establishing, as against the interests which lead to conflict, the interests which call for association and mutual assistance, it creates or stimulates sympathies and habits of helpfulness that give a psychological support and sanction to its mechanism of law, custom, and contract. It justifies the mass of social institutions and habitual ways of being, which it thus creates by the greater satisfaction and efficiency of the physical, the vital, and the mental life of man. In a word, by the growth and advantages of civilization. A good many losses have indeed to be written off as against these gains, but those are to be accepted as the price we must pay for civilization. The normal society treats man essentially as a physical, vital, and mental being. For the life, the mind, the body, are the three terms of existence with which it has some competence to deal. It develops a system of mental growth and efficiency, an intellectual, aesthetic, and moral culture. It evolves the vital side of human life and creates an ever-growing system of economic efficiency and vital enjoyment. And this system becomes more and more rich, cumbrous, and complex as civilization develops. Depressing by its mental and vital overgrowth the natural vigor of the physical and animal man, it tries to set the balance right by systems of physical culture, a cumbrous science of habits and remedies, intended to cure the ills it has created, and as much amelioration as it can manage of the artificial forms of living that are necessary to its social system. In the end, however, experience shows that society tends to die by its own development, a sure sign that there is some radical defect in its system, a certain proof that its idea of man and its method of development do not correspond to all the reality of the human being, and to the aim of life which that reality imposes. There is, then, a radical defect somewhere in the process of human civilization. But where is its seat, and by what issue shall we come out of the perpetual cycle of failure? Our civilized development of life ends in an exhaustion of vitality and a refusal of nature to lend her support any further to a continued advance upon these lines. Our civilized mentality, after disturbing the balance of the human system to its own greater profit, finally discovers that it has exhausted and destroyed that which fed it, and loses its power of healthy action and productiveness. It is found that civilization has created many more problems than it can solve, has multiplied excessive needs and desires, the satisfaction of which it has not sufficient vital force to sustain, has developed a jungle of claims and artificial instincts, in the midst of which life loses its way, and has no longer any sight of its aim. The more advanced minds begin to declare civilization a failure, and society begins to feel that they are right. But the remedy proposed is either a halt or even a retrogression, which means in the end more confusion, stagnation, and decay, or a reversion to nature, capital N, which is impossible or can only come about by a cataclysm and disintegration of society, or even a cure is aimed at by carrying artificial remedies to their acme, by more and more science, more and more mechanical devices, a more scientific organization of life, which means that the engine shall replace life. The arbitrary, logical reason substitute itself for complex nature, and man be saved by machinery. As well say that to carry a disease to its height is the best way to its cure. It may be suggested, on the contrary, and with some chance of knocking at the right door, that the radical defect of all our systems is their deficient development of just that which society has most neglected, the spiritual element, the soul in man, which is his true being. Even to have a healthy body, a strong vitality, and an active and clarified mind, and a field for their action and enjoyment, carries man no more than a certain distance. Afterwards he flags and tires for want of a real self-finding, a satisfying aim for his action and progress. These three things do not make the sum of a complete manhood. They are means to an ulterior end, and cannot be made forever an aim in themselves. Add a rich emotional life governed by a well-ordered ethical standard, and still there is the savor of something left out, some supreme good which these things mean, but do not in themselves arrive at, do not discover, till they go beyond themselves. Add a religious system and a widespread spirit of belief and piety, and still you have not found the means of social salvation. All these things human society has developed, but none of them has saved it from disillusionment, weariness, and decay. The ancient intellectual cultures of Europe ended in disruptive doubt and skeptical impotence, the pieties of Asia in stagnation and decline. Modern society has discovered a new principle of survival, progress. But the aim of that progress it has never discovered. unless the aim is always more knowledge, more equipment, convenience and comfort, more enjoyment, a greater and still greater complexity of the social economy, a more and more cumbrously opulent life. But these things must lead, in the end, where the old led, for they are only the same thing on a larger scale. They lead in a circle, that is to say, nowhere. They do not escape from the cycle of birth, growth, decay, and death. They do not really find the secret of self-prolongation by constant self-renewal, which is the principle of immortality, but only seem for a moment to find it by the illusion of a series of experiments, each of which ends in disappointment. That so far has been the nature of modern progress. Only in its new turn inwards, towards a greater subjectivity, now only beginning, is there a better hope. For by that turning it may discover that the real truth of man is to be found in his soul. It is not indeed certain that a subjective age will lead us there, but it gives us the possibility, can turn in that direction, if used rightly, the more inward movement. It will be said that this is an old discovery, and that it governed the old societies under the name of religion. But that was only an appearance. The discovery was there, but it was made for the life of the individual only, and even for him it looked beyond the earth for its fulfillment, and at earth only as the place of his preparation for a solitary salvation or release from the burden of life. Human society itself never seized on the discovery of the soul as a means for the discovery of the law of its own being, or on a knowledge of the soul's true nature and need, and its fulfillment as the right way of terrestrial perfection. If we look at the old religions, in their social as apart from their individual aspect, we see that the use society made of them was only of their most unspiritual, or at any rate of their less spiritual parts. It made use of them to give an august, awful, and would-be eternal sanction to its mass of customs and institutions. It made of them a veil of mystery against human questioning, and a shield of darkness against the innovator. So far as it saw in religion a means of human salvation and perfection, it laid hands upon it at once, to mechanize it, to catch the human soul, and bind it on the wheels of a social-religious machinery, to impose on it in the place of spiritual freedom an imperious yoke and an iron prison. It saddled upon the religious life of man a church, a priesthood, and a mass of ceremonies, and set over it a pack of watchdogs under the name of creeds and dogmas, dogmas which one had to accept and obey under pain of condemnation to eternal hell by an eternal judge beyond, just as one had to accept and to obey the laws of society on pain of condemnation to temporal imprisonment or death by a mortal judge below. This false socialization of religion has been always the chief cause of its failure to regenerate mankind. For nothing can be more fatal to religion than for its spiritual element to be crushed or formalized out of existence by its outward aids and forms and machinery. The falsehood of the old social use of religion is shown by its effects. History has exhibited more than once the coincidence of the greatest religious fervor and piety with darkest ignorance, with an obscure squalor and long vegetative stagnancy of the mass of human life, with the unquestioned reign of cruelty, injustice, and oppression, or with an organization of the most ordinary, unaspiring, and unraised existence, hardly relieved by some touches of intellectual or half-spiritual light on the surface. The end of all this, a widespread revolt that turned first of all against the established religion as the keystone of a regnant falsehood, evil, and ignorance. It is another sign when the too scrupulously exact observation of a socio-religious system and its rites and forms, which, by the very fact of this misplaced importance, begin to lose their sense and true religious value, becomes the law and most prominent aim of religion, rather than any spiritual growth of the individual and the race. And a great sign, too, of this failure is when the individual is obliged to flee from society in order to find room for his spiritual growth, when, finding human life given over to the unregenerated mind, life, and body, and the place of spiritual freedom occupied by the bonds of form, by the church and shastra, by some law of the ignorance, he is obliged to break away from all these, to seek for growth into the spirit in the monastery, on the mountaintop, in the cavern, in the desert, and the forest. When there is that division between life and the spirit, sentence of condemnation is passed upon human life. Either it is left to circle in its routine, or it is decried as worthless and unreal, a vanity of vanities, and loses that confidence in itself and inner faith in the value of its terrestrial aims, shraddha, without which it cannot come to anything. For the spirit of man must strain towards the heights. When it loses its tension of endeavor, the race must become immobile and stagnant, or even sink towards darkness and the dust. Even where life rejects the spirit, or the spirit rejects life, there may be a self-affirmation of the inner being. There may even be a glorious crop of saints and hermits in a forcing soil of spirituality. But unless the race, the society, the nation is moved towards the spiritualization of life, or moves forward, led by the light of an ideal, the end must be littleness, weakness, and stagnation. Or the race has to turn to the intellect for rescue, for some hope or new ideal, and arrive by a circle through an age of rationalism at a fresh effort towards the restatement of spiritual truth and a new attempt to spiritualize human life.